Hello everyone, and welcome to the AE Tech Airsoft channel. If you like what you're watching, please like and subscribe to the video below. I'm very excited to announce that we're launching DDC Industries, a new venture that will focus on developing high-quality airsoft parts and accessories. I've included a link in the description below, so please visit our website as we will be launching several new parts focused on the Tokyo Marui MP7 gas flowback model over the next few months. In this video, we're going to go over our new enhanced secondary sear for the MP7, which will be released on the website shortly. Okay guys, so I want to just go over quickly what this product offers for the Tokyo Marui MP7. So a lot of owners of this model will find that when they go to try and use the charging lever here, like so, to load a BB into the chamber, what will often happen is the bolt carrier will not return forward far enough to trip that secondary sear and allow the replica to fire. So what will happen is you'll load your magazine in, you'll pull the bolt carrier, or excuse me, the charging handle back and release it, and then you'll go to fire, you'll pull the trigger, and you'll feel nothing. The hammer won't drop, the replica won't fire. It'll be like the trigger is just freely moving back and forth. And this can be really frustrating, especially if you're mid-game. So what our product does is it allows that secondary sear to engage a little bit earlier, and that completely resolves this issue, as I'm going to show here in a second. So if I go ahead, just make sure we got no BBs in there. If I go ahead and take my magazine, so I've loaded this just about all the way with BBs, maybe one or two missing, and I load it into the replica. I'm actually going to point the MP7, so I'm pointing not at myself, but up towards the ceiling. So if you think about it, this is a worst case scenario. And I'm going to pull the charging lever back. I'm going to let it go forward. And now with it forward, I'm going to put it on semi. And let's see if we can demo this. I'm going to fire a quick shot here. I got my safety glasses on. And look at that. It shot. I would almost guarantee you that if this was the stock Tokyo Marui and you tried the same test where you pointed it at the sky and charged it with the charging handle like I just did, you would get the dead trigger issue most of the time. So this product completely alleviates that. Sometimes this issue can also crop up even when you use the bolt lever release, although that tends to be a bit better. So you could be mid-game shooting, your replica runs out of BBs and the bolt locks back, you reload, you flip this lever up to release the bolt, you go to fire and click, nothing. So this product will help resolve that and ensure that when you go to fire your replica that it will indeed go off. It's an upgrade I think any TM MP7 GBB user will appreciate. Before we go ahead and begin the disassembly process, I always like to review the tools I use in these videos. So going left to right, I've got a number 0 Phillips screwdriver, I've got a number 1 Phillips screwdriver, and a number 2 Phillips screwdriver. We're going to use these in the chassis and a few other fasteners. I've got two 90-degree picks that we're going to use later in the video to handle some of the springs and sears. I've got a small flathead screwdriver that we're going to use to help remove some of the levers. I've got a 1/16 inch Starrett pin punch, and then of course we've got some of the Super Lube multi-purpose synthetic grease that I like to use for lubricant. Thankfully, the Tokyo Marui MP7 is a fairly simple replica to work on thanks to its inner and outer chassis design. Our first step is simply going to be to field strip the replica, which I'll start right now. First, we're going to remove the two pins from the rear of the receiver, and we're just going to set these aside. So there's our upper and lower pins removed. With those out, we can then remove the backplate assembly from the model, along with the charging handle and recoil spring. So I'm just going to pull those all the way out, and we're going to set that off camera here off to the side. Next, we're going to pull out our bolt carrier unit, which is this component right here, and we'll put that up again up to the top off to the side. And now we have the model field strip, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Okay guys, so now that we have the model field stripped, we can begin the process of removing the inner chassis from the receiver. So our first step is going to be to remove the selector lever here. And what we're going to do is remove the small screw on the right selector switch that holds it in place, and we can do that with our number 0 Phillips screwdriver. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that screw now. And now that we've got that screw removed, we can just set it off to the side. Now my right selector lever tends to just pull off since I've taken this model apart a few times. So I'm able to just remove it. If yours is more stubborn, or maybe a newer model where this fit is still really tight, what you can do is you can take just about any sort of tool or something to space the receiver off your table. And I'm going to kind of lay this screwdriver in about this location. And the goal here basically is to just provide some room for the selector lever to come out. And then we can take a small flathead screwdriver and we're going to put it on the axle, which you can see the half moon shape inside of the right selector lever here. And we can just give it a tap. And that will also free up this lever. With our lever removed now, we should be able to see some of the axle sticking out. Now again, if your model is new, it may be a little bit tight to push out this selector lever. If you just tapped it like I did, it might be dislodged a little bit, but if not, all you need to do is once again making sure you've got, you're either holding this in your hand or you've got it spaced off the table. You can just give this a small tap. One more thing I'll note here before I do that, you want to make sure that the selector is in the safe position. If it's in one of the other positions, it will be much more difficult to remove, if not impossible. So with it in the safe position, I'm just going to give this a tap. And you can see it's popped out a bit, and now I can just simply remove it from the receiver. And that's removing the fire selector. So now with the fire selector removed, we can go ahead and work on our bolt release. So the process is very similar. This time we're going to remove the screw from the left side bolt catch. And once again, I'm going to use my number 0 Phillips screwdriver, and we're just going to unthread this. We can set our screw aside once it's removed, and this lever may not wiggle off nicely. This one tends to be a little more stubborn. So just like the selector, fire selector, we're going to use a small flathead screwdriver, and again you can see the axle protruding through the center of the bolt catch here, and we're just going to tap it out. So I'm actually tilting this again off the table just to give some room for the bolt release lever to just come out. If you lay it flat, eventually that lever is going to hit the table and then it's not going to move anymore, and you might damage something if you keep tapping it. So I'm going to hold my driver in position there and just give this a light tap. Yep, that's all it took. So actually my lever now is completely free, so I can easily remove that and set it aside, and my bolt catch just popped right out. If yours doesn't, just like the fire control selector, you'll be able to just give it a light tap and push it out from the side. So that's removing the bolt catch assembly. Okay guys, so now that we've got the fire control selector and the bolt catch lever assemblies removed from the MP7, our next step is going to be to remove the trigger pin. This step's fairly straightforward. The only thing to note here is from the factory, the trigger pin has a little bit of a knurl on one side only. And Marui assembles this with the pin on the right side, or towards the right side of the receiver. So that means to remove it, we want to push it out from the left side towards the right. If your MP7's new, this should be the correct way to do it. However, if other folks have taken this apart, the pin could be put back in any which way. So if you find it's fighting you a bit as you're pushing it out and you don't see the knurling protruding immediately, you will want to switch directions and tap it out the opposite direction. So, and again, here you want to make sure you've got some clearance underneath the model. My flashlight mounted on my replica here kind of is spacing off the table, so I've got some room for that pin to come out. So I'm going to take my Starrett 1/16 inch pin punch, and I'm just going to use the back of this screwdriver, and we're just going to give the pin a very light tap. Yep, and you can see mine came right out almost effortlessly. And I can remove the pin all the way. So we can see on the right side there, there's some knurling. We want that to stay to the right side of the receiver to follow the manual. So I'm going to set that aside. And now the trigger should just simply come right out. We can put that up there as well. and that's removing the trigger and trigger spring from the MP7. Okay guys, we're getting there. So now that we've removed all those pins, the inner chassis is simply going to slide out from the receiver. So I'm going to reach in from the back here and just begin pulling out my inner chassis. Now as you pull it out, you're going to want to watch this side. We're going to see our trigger bar. And the trigger bar has a small spring that keeps it preloaded upwards. So we're just going to want to hold the trigger bar in position so none of that goes flying. So I'm holding it with my right thumb here, and then I can completely pull the inner chassis out of the receiver. So we'll put the receiver off to the side here, and I'm still holding the trigger bar sort of in position. It won't come flying out, but if you spin this around, it'll probably fall out. So we're just going to go ahead and remove that now. Make sure you pay attention to this spring. You do not want to lose this. I would recommend holding this over a table, so if this falls out, you don't lose it. That spring is very important. So I'm just going to lift the trigger bar out gently. So here's our trigger bar. Set that aside, and then we can remove our spring. Our trigger bar spring off to the side. And then we can also take out this selector lug. This should just lift out. No big deal there. And that's removing the inner chassis from the receiver. Next, we'll get into splitting open this chassis and getting to our enhanced Sear installation. Okay guys, so before we disassemble the inner chassis assembly, we first need to release the tension in the hammer unit here. And this is an important step. If you don't do this, you put yourself at risk for the inner components here to go flying all over the place when you remove the screws that hold the chassis together. So I'm going to show you how to do it. It's very easy. I'm going to use these two 90-degree picks. I find these work the best, although you could use a variety of tools here to do this. So in order to release the hammer, two things need to happen. First, we need to pull the hammer sear forward. So I can show you right here. This is spring-loaded, so you can see I can pull this and slide it forward. This is actually what the trigger bar activates when you pull the trigger. It pulls this component forward. Now, if you look inside the chassis, there's another silver component sticking up here. This is the secondary sear. So this is also spring-loaded. So I can reach in there with my pick, and you can see that this is spring-loaded as well. So both of these sears need to be activated in order for the hammer to fall. The one inside here is normally tripped by the bolt carrier returning forward. There's a lug on that will pull this forward when the bolt's all the way seated in. So I can reach in with one of my picks and pull this guy forward, and see if I can do this on camera. I'm going to grab the second pick and use that to activate the hammer sear. So I'll try and capture this on video. So I'm pulling the inner one forward, and I'm push the hammer sear, and you heard that snap. So that was the hammer releasing. We can see the hammer's forward now. So now we've just taken all the spring tension out of the hammer unit, and we're ready to go ahead and start taking this chassis apart. Okay guys, so to disassemble the inner chassis, we're going to need a couple different Phillips screwdrivers. So first I'm going to start just in the rear here and remove this large one using the number 2 screwdriver. Set that one aside. Next I can switch over to the 0, and we'll go ahead and remove some of these front ones. Okay, and then finally we can use our number 1 here to remove these bottom 2. And there we go, guys. This one is loose. It just would not tap out of the receiver. So I'm going to go ahead and gently lift off the right half of the chassis. Now there is a spring here that's putting a little bit of tension on it. Nothing to worry about. You just might feel that as you lift it off. Oh, and it looks like we might have just a little bit of this screw hanging on here. Just loosen a bit. There we go. And now I can put this off to the side, and there you go. We've got the chassis split open. If you pay attention over onto this side, you can see the spring and the hammer strut. This should stay seated when you remove the right half of the chassis. That's why I recommend doing that one first. And we're going to take this opportunity now to just alleviate the spring tension here. So I'm just holding everything carefully. I just pulled the spring gently out of that pocket. That way nothing goes flying, and we can actually remove the spring and set that aside down here. The hop up and barrel unit will also just come right out, so we can move that out of the way and put that to the side. And then in our next portion of the video, we'll go over removing the hammer unit. Okay, so to remove the hammer unit is also straightforward. We're just going to rotate the chassis to the opposite side. You just want to be careful. There are a few springs here. Just flip this over carefully and lay it on the table. And now I'm once again going to use my #1 Phillips screwdriver, and I'm just going to remove these last two fasteners from the chassis. And with those two removed, we should now again be able to just lift this half of the chassis out. Again, parts should not come flying, but I would still be careful during this step. And now we have our hammer unit fully removed from the inner chassis, and we're ready to go ahead and begin installing our new enhanced part. Okay guys, so if we take a look carefully here at the hammer unit, and again be careful because a lot of these parts are under spring tension, we can take a look. This is actually the secondary Sear that we're going to be replacing. Now in this hammer unit I've already installed the upgraded one, but normally you would find the stock Tokyo Marui part here. And what I typically do is I will put my thumb over the spring and just carefully lift this out. And you can see that works pretty nicely because it keeps the spring from flying. And then we can just carefully pull the spring out of here. I'm actually going to use my 90-degree pick just to help out with this. There we go. And there's our spring and our secondary Sear. So that's removing the secondary Sear, and next we'll get into cleaning and then reassembly. Okay guys, so before we go ahead and install our new part, I recommend taking the opportunity here to just wipe off some of the excess grease and oil from inside the hammer unit where our new part's going to be going in. You want to just clean off any of this old residue and use this as a good chance to put fresh grease in here. It's important that the part has a nice layer of grease on it. That's going to help it slide a little bit easier and make it a bit easier for the bolt to trip this lever. So I'm going to go ahead and use some of the multi-purpose synthetic grease. I like to thin this out with a little bit of silicone oil, but you can just use the stock grease and just put a very thin layer on both the left side and the right side of this Sear, where it's going to be sliding in the hammer unit and against the chassis here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we can get into reassembly. Okay guys, so I've gone ahead and greased this component. So I'm going to go and load this back into the hammer unit just like this, just the way we took it out. And then I'm going to slide it all the way to the right. And with it in that position, we can then reinstall the secondary Sear spring. So I'm going to load it in on one side and then just sort of gently compress it with my other finger. Be careful here, you don't want to bend the spring, and you just want to get it tucked down into position. You'll probably be really tempted now to test it out. Just be very careful, because if you do that, the spring can go flying. So if you want to push it, the lever, and feel it, I would put your thumb over the spring, and then you can kind of feel it this way. So that feels pretty good. So next we'll get into reassembling the inner chassis. Okay guys, so the first step to reassembling the hammer unit into the chassis is to slide the hammer spring back onto the strut, making sure that the hammer is in the fired or decocked position. And again, as you're handling this hammer unit, make sure the springs do not pop out. If you're gentle, they should stay in place. I'm going to flip it over to this side, and then we can take the left chassis half, and what we want to do is, if you look at the chassis, there's a lug here and a lug in the front, and those line up with the spring pocket here and this small slot pocket here in the back. So we have to line those up in order for it to seat correctly against the chassis. So I'm going to go ahead and put the hammer spring, get that started in its pocket. Then I'm going to push this whole unit back towards the rear of the chassis, just like this. And at the same time now I'm going to push against the chassis. And you kind of heard it like click a little bit. You shouldn't have to push very hard. There shouldn't be a ton of spring tension here because the unit's decocked. It shouldn't be too hard. And you can see I've got it seated properly. There's no gap here. So that looks good. I'm keeping pressure on this so that it doesn't come apart. We're going to flip it over, and then I'm going to reinstall these two Phillips screws using my #1 Phillips driver. Now one thing I want to note here for torquing these down, I like to use what I call the 3-finger method. It was taught to me a long time ago by some folks that fly RC helicopters when I was big into that. But basically, once you get the screw to the point where it sort of stops turning, before you actually apply any torque, or rather than applying torque like this where you grab the driver and really twist, these small fasteners you need to be more gentle with. So what I usually do is once it stops turning, I grab it with just 3 fingers and I torque it as much as I can with those. And that usually works out to about 6 or 7 inch-pounds, depending on how strong you are, of torque. You'll find your fingers will just slip. That really helps to prevent you from stripping out bolts. So I'm going to do the same thing here. And again, you don't need to twist super hard. It doesn't need that much torque to retain these screws. So that's getting the hammer unit back into the left side of the receiver. You can see our spring's still seated in here. Everything's still intact. We look good to go. So our next step will be to reassemble the right half back on. Okay guys, so the first step in assembling the right half back on is to install the barrel and hop-up unit back into the chassis. And this drops in pretty easily. The only thing to note here is you're going to have to hold this spring back because it's supposed to sit on this face of the chassis. And it'll tend to want to slip underneath as you're doing this. So I like to hold it back, and then I drop the barrel assembly into position, like so. Yeah, and that looks pretty good right there. The spring will make it kind of want to pivot out, so I tend to just, there we go, I tend to just kind of hold on to it, and then we can pick up our right half, and we're just going to lay that right across here, lining it up with the other side of the receiver. Now, if you saw, the spring just kind of slipped out on me, so I'm just going to use my fingers here and pull that back. And I don't know if you, hopefully that click just came through on the camera, but if we did everything correctly, I'm keeping pressure on these two chassis halves to keep them from slipping. You can see there's no gap here, no gap here, and our spring, see if I can get this on the camera, is all the way forward. It's not caught underneath the chassis, so I can actually pull it back and away. If you find you can't close the two chassis halves, it's probably this spring. That would be the first thing I'd look at. It should be, again, sitting on this front face, not inside the hole for the hop-up barrel. So just handle this carefully. Make sure you keep pressure on these until you get the bolts in. I'm going to lay it back on the table, and then I can take my 2 bolts here, and we can reinstall all the Phillips screws starting with these 2. Okay guys, next we got to reinstall the trigger bar spring, and the selector lug. This is not a difficult step, but I do see a few folks mess up the trigger bar spring, so we'll go over that in a second. So we're going to take a look at our fire selector. We want to make sure this odd-shaped lug is facing up, just like that. Drop it into place. Then we can take our trigger bar, and that's going to just also drop right into place, basically aligned this way. So that should sit down nice. Now if you look at our spring, there's 2 different tangs on it. One is straight on the left side here, and then if you notice, the other tang is bent 90 degrees. So this 90-degree end is going to fit inside this hole here, just like so. And what we're going to do, this straight tang side, I'll actually remove this for a second, is going to get hooked around the trigger bar like this ultimately. That's where we want it to wind up. So we're going to use our 90-degree pick to sort of help out with that. So if I go ahead and drop the trigger bar back in, put the spring back into this hole, I'm just then going to lift up the trigger bar a little so I can get my spring sort of close to being in position. And if you just gently keep a little bit of pressure on the trigger bar, it's going to want to like pop out. But then I can flip it over and we can actually see the spring tang in here. And I'm just going to grab it with my pick, and you probably heard that click. So I just pulled the spring tang and pulled it until it was over the lug. So see if we can show that on camera. Hopefully that's showing up. You can see the spring tang on the top, or I guess in this view, the bottom side of the lug, exactly where we want it. Now it might be very tempting to let off the trigger bar right now, or to like play with it to feel the spring. Again, you can do that, but this very easily will pop back out and you'll have to do this again. So just be careful. If you want to test it, again, just kind of hold the trigger bar in place and you should be able to sort of push this down, and it should be want to spring loaded back up this way. So that's reinstalling the trigger bar. I'm going to gently put this down for the moment, and then we'll go to our next segment where we will be reinstalling this into the receiver. Okay guys, so I brought the receiver back onto the video. So this step is very straightforward. So actually what you're going to want to do is hold the receiver upside down like this, and we're going to want to put the chassis upside down. The reason for that, I'm going to hold my chassis carefully here. This rotating lug in the front needs to be in this position in order to fit into the receiver. And if you do it upright, guess what? That lug's gravity's going to want to pull it down, and you're going to be fighting that the whole time. But if you do it upside down, that lug will stay down, which is going to make this a lot easier. So again, keeping my finger kind of holding this trigger bar in position. You don't want that to pop out as you're sliding it back into the receiver, or you could bend the trigger bar. So upside down, thumb holding this in place. I'm going to pick this up upside down, and we're just going to gently sort of align this into the receiver. You can kind of use the angles of the receiver to judge where to get it started. And once you've got it started, it should slide in pretty easily. Again, you might need to wiggle a few parts. Looks like we're looking good there. And that's now fully back installed. So the only thing I did there, I did kind of like shake this just to get that pivoting portion all the way down and lined up. But this should slide in fairly effortlessly. Maybe with a little gentle back and forth, and then eventually it should just slide right in, just like you saw. So I'm just looking here to make sure that the pinholes are lined up, and it looks like we are. So we've got our inner receiver back in. Next, we're going to go through reinstalling the bolt catch assembly, the trigger, and the fire selector. So I always like to start with the trigger. So I'm going to take our trigger and our trigger pin, and this is very easy. You just need to insert the trigger back up into position here. No special alignment or anything other than to realign the holes. And if you might remember, the Marui factory position for this pin is for the knurling to be towards the right side. So I'm actually going to insert this from the right side of the receiver. Oops, my trigger came out. Just put that back into alignment. So once I got the trigger lined up, take my knurling out towards the right side of the receiver. I'll just push that back into position, and you might need to just tap or push that back into place, and that's reinstalling the trigger. Next, we're going to do the bolt catch. The bolt catch also fairly straightforward. So I'm going to take the lever that has the axle, and that's going to go in from the right side of the receiver. So I'm just going to get that lined up. Now it should slide in effortlessly until the last 2 or 3 millimeters or so, and then you might have to just push on this gently. You can hear that little snap. That's the detent, the spring-loaded detent that keeps that pushed down. And then we can flip our receiver back over, and then I'm going to put the left bolt catch on just like in this orientation like this. There's the half moon shape must be lined up on the shaft or it won't fit. Nice pokey yoke there on Marui's part. Mine slides right on. You might need to very gently tap it on with either a soft gripped screwdriver or maybe a rubber mallet. But once you've got that fully seated, like I do here, I like to just squeeze it and make sure it's all the way in. We can then reinstall the small screw using our #1 Phillips screwdriver here. So on these screws, these ones are very small, so these especially do not need much torque. Otherwise you will strip these out. So I'm going to just, if I usually use my 3-finger method, I'm not even going to apply full torque here. I'm just going to give it just a little bit. Again, you don't want this to fall out, but you also do not want to strip this. These Marui parts at the moment are very difficult to come by. We're hoping to fix that in the near future for you guys. So that's reinstalling the bolt release assembly, and finally we'll go to the fire control selector next. Okay guys, so very similar deal with the fire control selector. This one, especially on a new Marui, might be a little more challenging to reseat, but it's still pretty straightforward. So we're going to take this side with the axle, the left lever, and we can just insert it into its hole here. Just like when we took it apart, we want to make sure that the lever is pointed in the safe position. And then this step may require you to gently tap this down, especially if it's new. If it's used, you might be able to do it with your finger, like I'm able to here. So I just pushed it straight down into position, but again, you might have to tap it down with a nice soft gripped screwdriver, or maybe a rubber mallet, something soft. I wouldn't use a metal hammer on this. Once you've got it seated all the way, we can flip it over. And just like the bolt release, we're going to put the other lever on. Again, it's pokey-yoke with the half moon. That half moon and push into position. Again, this should sort of just slide on, or maybe take a couple gentle taps with something soft. Once you've got that seated, we're going to put the screw back using our #1 Phillips screwdriver. All right, look at that, folks. We just reassembled the MP7 inner chassis assembly. The hard part is behind us, and now we just got to reassemble our field strip, and we can go test our model. Okay guys, so one more very important step before we reinstall our bolt carrier. Since we decocked the hammer, we actually do need to cock it again in order for our bolt carrier to fit in properly. So if you look inside the receiver port, you can see our hammer's up. So all I got to do is reach in through the back of the receiver with my finger, and I'm going to manually cock the hammer. So I'm just pulling it back until I hear it lock into position. So if we take a look here, I can see it's all the way down. And now with that done, we can begin reassembling from the field strip condition. So I'm going to take my bolt carrier. You're going to want to apply a nice thin layer of grease. And I would also, while you've got this apart, recommend applying that thin grease inside here in your nozzle. You want this area to be well lubricated in order to keep this nozzle from sticking, which can happen on this particular replica. So once we've got those greased up, I'm going to go ahead and get this partially inserted in here. I want to make sure I've got this slot sticking out. And I've already got the stock back plate, charging lever, and recoil rod assembly already sort of pre-assembled together. So we'll just get these two levers lined up just like that, and we can start sliding it forward. The recoil rod sort of has this half moon sort of shape. You want the flat side to be down, and we want the rounded side to be up, just like I've got it here. And then that'll sit inside this pocket in the back of the bolt carrier. So I'll slide that forward, and you can see it kind of tucks in there. And the last step is we want to make sure this lug of the charging lever is inside the slot on top of the bolt carrier. So I'm just going to put this down, push that forward. There we go. Just like that. So you can see I've got that hooked in here. So now I should be able to slide everything forward back into the receiver. Oop, it's popped out again. This can be done without the stock attached to. It's a little easier, but here we go. I got it started now. So now we should be able to just slide this home, just like so. And then our two pins will just go right back in. Just make sure this back plate's seated all the way. There's one. There's two. And now if we do a quick test, yep, looks like we're cycling again, and we've got our replica completely put together. So that's the entire process for disassembling installing the enhanced secondary sear, and then reassembling the Marui MP7 GBB. Okay guys, so thanks again for watching our video on the enhanced sear upgrade for the Tokyo Marui MP7 gas blowback model. We hope you found this video useful, whether you're installing the enhanced sear or looking to have some guidance on how to disassemble the inner chassis. We look forward to bringing you more videos and more upgrades for your MP7 and other airsoft models in the future. So please like and subscribe to the channel, and thank you again for watching.